The meme of Prince Eugen being a luck vampire that sucked away all the good fortune of her sisters is perhaps a bit overplayed. However, there is no denying that the fate of her sister, Blücher, was an unfortunate one. Her ready for active service career lasted for days. Her enemy, that sank her, was older than the fathers of her crew, perhaps even the grandfathers of some of the younger ones. She didn't even get to go out to air attack or fighting another ship. She went out to an old fortress, manned by men who lived in a country that hadn't seen a war since before Germany was a unified state, using weapons that predated the Dreadnought Revolution at the youngest. It was a triumph for the Norwegians. It was a mark of shame for the Germans. Through it all, it was a sad fate for a beautiful ship, thrown away by men who underestimated their enemy. All that being said, Blücher's life started as the second of the Admiral Hipper-class cruisers, laid down on August 15, 1936. This class of cruiser was built under the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which allowed the Germans to build 50,000 tons of heavy cruisers. The Germans took that and decided upon 5 10,000-tonners, which would ostensibly hold to the Washington Treaty limit on cruiser tonnage. Of course, as anyone who has read about these cruisers could tell you, they did not, at all, hold to that stated limit. In Blücher's case, as each ship was slightly different from the others, she ended up displacing about 16,000 tons on her standard loading. Her full load pushed that up to 18,500 or so tons, which is really quite a lot for any cruiser. That displacement allowed for 8 20.3 centimeter, 8-inch guns, and 4 twin turrets. A super-firing pair forward, and another super-firing pair to the aft. Supporting these were 12 10.5 centimeter, 4.1-inch dual-purpose guns, a further 12 37mm anti-aircraft guns, and 8 20mm cannon. That weaponry would be rounded out by 12 21-inch torpedo tubes, which makes one think the Germans seem to like the number 12 when it comes to her weaponry. To finish it off, while not strictly a weapon, Blücher also would have carried 3 scout aircraft and a single catapult. As for her armor protection, that ranged from 70 to 80 millimeters, 2.8 to 3.1 inches, on her belt, with a deck of 20 to 50 millimeters, or for the non-metric audience, slightly less than an inch to just under 2 inches at the thickest. Her speed, meanwhile, came out to 32 knots on 132,000 shaft horsepower. Not the fastest cruiser around, but also not the slowest. However, as mentioned earlier, she wouldn't really get the chance to put any of that to real use. After launching on June 8, 1937, Blücher entered into her fitting out phase. This would take a little over 2 years, partially due to changing her bow from a straight stem to a clipper bow. The result would be that Blücher only commissioned into the Kriegsmarine on September 20th, 1939. By this point, the Second World War was coming up on a month old. Despite that, she would not immediately join the fleet at war. Sea trials are still necessary, even at war, and the German fleet wasn't getting into massive fleet engagements. As such, she would spend the remainder of 1939 on various trials. She would test out her machinery and weaponry, along with training her crew. Blücher would then return to port, have various refits and changes made in response to the trials, before setting out to repeat the entire process. All of this is fairly typical of sea trials, as the ship is put through her paces. It would be because of these trials, and time in port, that Blücher only properly joined the fleet on April 5th, 1940. Following combat training with the old light cruiser Emden, she was promptly assigned to the invasion of Norway. In fact, she was the flagship of the force sent to take Oslo, the Norwegian capital. Quite the honor for a ship that had only formally joined the fleet a couple days before the operation even started. On April 8th, Blücher set out for Norway. In this, she was joined by Lutzow, the ex-Deutschland, Emden, and several smaller ships for escort. This force, Group 5 of the overall invasion force, was again intended to take the Norwegian capital. However, even before they got there, the ships were already dodging torpedoes. HMS Triton spotted the German convoy on their way to Norway and fired a spread of torpedoes at them. The Germans evaded the torpedoes and continued on their way to their target, arriving on the night of April 8th. The Norwegians weren't caught completely by surprise, as a patrol boat spotted the German formation around 11 p.m. that night. This boat, POL-3, was able to get off a report of being attacked by unknown warships before she was set alight and abandoned. As an interesting side note here, that patrol boat would be captured by the Germans later that month, end up surviving the war, and be handed back to Norway at the end of the war, where she would be sold off and only be scrapped in 2011. That's impressive no matter how you look at it. As for Blücher herself, she had a few warning shots fired at her by Norwegian shore batteries, though they all missed. After transferring some of the landing force to her escorts after midnight on April 9th, the cruiser began to move up the fjord towards Oslo. It is at this point that overconfidence really comes into play here. Blücher was decently armored for her day and age. Her guns were quite capable weapons. Her fire control and other systems were all state-of-the-art. However, she took all of that advanced equipment into a very narrow passage, one made even narrower by small islands. This would be a dangerous passage to take in normal circumstances, let alone at night and as an enemy warship. As such, one could consider it a strong natural defense for Oslo. The military defenses must have seemed much less a threat to German eyes. The primary linchpin of Norwegian defense was the Oscarsborg fortress. This was an antique fortification dating back to the 1850s, and was, in fact, so old that some sources say the Germans marked it as a museum on their charts. Regardless of the truth of that claim, there is no denying the fortress was old. Even her weapons were old, if not quite, almost 100 years old, like the fort itself. In 1893, three 28cm, 11-inch guns had been purchased from Germany. These Krupp-built guns were installed into the fort and would remain there right up to the German invasion. So old were these guns and their mountings that they were open-top barbettes, having been put in place well before the advent of air power. Almost as old was the torpedo battery, placed on a tiny island nearby. This battery was an underground one, which led to the Germans not even knowing it was there. Though, one can imagine, even had they known, they would have dismissed it much as they had the fortress. That torpedo battery dated back to 1901. The torpedoes it held were ancient 450mm, 17.7-inch Whitehead torpedoes that had been produced in Austria-Hungary. These were slow weapons at 27 knots and only carried a 220-pound warhead. Not by any means a threatening weapon in 1940, unless you happened to be sailing right past them without knowing they were there. Assuming they worked, of course, because the Norwegians had only ever tested them, and not very often at that. There were also two smaller forts opposite Oscarsborg, though they were just as outdated. One held three British 6-inch guns dating back to 1899. The other had even older 6-pounder 57mm guns. When it came to manning these defenses, Norway intended to have a garrison of 1,400 enlisted men and 210 officers. As it turned out, they only mustered 613 enlisted men and 83 officers, most of whom were either just starting their training or on the verge of retirement. The former were so new that the entire reason Blücher didn't run into a mine, which the Norwegians had, was because planting those minefields was part of the training process. An overall command of this motley lot was one Colonel Ericsson, a man 64 years old and only 6 months away from his retirement. This mix of ancient weaponry and ill-suited men was arrayed against the most modern cruiser in the German fleet. One could be forgiven for thinking that Blücher could just blast her way past the defenses, even if the Norwegians fought back. As it would turn out, that didn't happen. It would actually be the Norwegians who opened fire first. Ericsson had ordered all three of his antique 11-inch guns loaded, though he only had enough trained artillerymen for manning one of them. So he simply split the trained crew in half and recruited everything from cooks to drivers to reservists who showed up on their own to fill it out. In so doing, he could have 2 of the guns manned and ready, with the third loaded, but without a crew. It should be noted at this point that Eriksson did not know for certain that the approaching ships were hostile. He could infer it, as warning shots had been fired down the fjord, and the ships certainly didn't look friendly. But in choosing to not fire a warning shot, he was taking a real risk of starting a war that Norway didn't want. Had the Germans not already decided to start the war, of course. In any event, Eriksson forewent a warning shot. His mixed bag of men that could only charitably be called a gun crew could never reload the old guns in time. He had 3 shots and would not be likely to get more. So he simply waited until Blücher was at point-blank range, about 1,300 meters, a little less than a mile, away. His response when asked what he was doing has gone down in history. Either I will be decorated, or I will be court-martialed. Fire. And so the Norwegians fired first. The 2 big guns blasted away at Blücher, landing direct hits. One hit above her bridge, killing and wounding several men, along with knocking out the main rangefinder. The second shell hit amidships around her hangar. This set both of the Arados that Blücher carried on fire, which quickly began to burn out of control. Not helped by munitions carried on deck for the army troops, which began to explode and add to the chaos. While the big guns were abandoned at this point, and the third loaded gun never fired, the smaller guns across the passage opened fire. These did little direct damage, though they did cause more explosions in the army supplies, as well as knocking out power and rudder control. Blücher returned fire in both directions with her flak guns. The Norwegians had to take cover as the flaming heavy cruiser continued down the passage. Only temporarily, though, as they soon returned to their guns and set about firing at Lutzow instead, which is a story for another video. As this was happening, Blücher had run up to full speed and steered for the middle of the channel. This got her past the guns, but brought her square into the sights of the torpedo battery. In common with the fortress, this was commanded by an old man. In this case, 61-year-old Andreas Andersen, who was actually retired at the time. He had been given temporary command of the battery, in large part because he had served there before. He had begun his career at it in 1909 and retired as its commander in 1927. There was no better man to put in command, and even the men he commanded were reservists who were quite familiar with the torpedoes. His well-oiled crew would fire 2 torpedoes, both of which, in spite of their age, ran straight and true. First one, then another torpedo hit Blücher in her port side. The combination of these hits and the earlier gunfire had almost entirely disabled the cruiser, though she managed to limp out of the arcs of most of the Norwegian guns. Unfortunately for her, even after anchoring to fight the fires, they were largely out of control. The constant explosion of ammunition on her decks hampered firefighting efforts. The detonation of bombs carried for her float planes certainly didn't help matters. Eventually, the fire spread to the amidships magazine for her secondary battery. The explosion that resulted blew a hole in her side, opening Blücher to the sea and spewing out fuel oil to add to the fire. What had already been a severe 10-degree list to port grew even greater. With the fires out of control and the ship rapidly beginning to roll over, the order to abandon ship was given at 6 in the morning on April 9th, 1940. Blücher rolled over and slipped beneath the waves less than 30 minutes later. The amount of men who went down with her is debated, though the most common figure is going to be somewhere around 300 men between her crew and the soldiers she was carrying. Her wreck remains there to this day, beneath some 64 meters, about 210 feet of water. One of her float planes was pulled up in 1994, her screws were removed in the 1950s, and much of her fuel oil was removed at the same time as the float plane. Otherwise, in spite of the odd call to raise her hulk, she remains undisturbed as a war grave to this day. As for the fortress and torpedo battery, those had, in sinking Blücher, slowed down the German invasion just long enough for the Norwegian government and royal family to flee into exile, taking the country's gold reserves with them. While they couldn't stop the German invasion, this is by no means a small feat in its own right, as is the fact that the torpedo battery remained in active use until 1993, after being modernized in the 1980s. The guns in the fortress, meanwhile, would see their most recent use in firing blanks for the production of the movie The King's Choice in 2016, which has an excellent depiction of the sinking of Blücher that you can easily find on YouTube. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and I'll see you in the next one.